Beijing will have to make its own decisions about how it proceeds, whether it provides military assistance. But if it goes down that road, it will come at real cost to China. And I think China's leaders are weighing that as they make their decisions.
That was U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on CNN's State of the Union, weighing in on the anniversary of the Ukraine war, warning China against lending any support to Russia.
China hasn't given Russia lethal aid, but according to the White House, they haven't ruled it out, a move that the U.S. says would be a mistake. Here to weigh in on how the Russia-Ukraine conflict is adding to already strained U.S. China relations is Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S. China Tech War. Welcome, Gordon.
Thank you so much, Batya and Robbie.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Obviously, this is a very pivotal moment in the U.S.-China relationship, strained for a number of reasons, and Biden visiting Ukraine last week on the anniversary of the conflict with Russia. What do you expect China to do, with, if anything, with respect to Russia's position in Ukraine?
I expect China to actually show even more support for Russia. China's been all in from the very beginning of this conflict. And from the beginning of this conflict, China has been providing lethal assistance to Russia. And we've seen this, especially, this last couple of weeks, there were the reports that China was selling drones to the Wagner Group for use in the war. Also, the Breaking Defense website reports that almost every day, an AN-124, which is the largest cargo plane in the world, leaves Zhengzhou in China. That's the central part of the country, carrying ammunition and other high consumption rate items. I think Jake Sullivan and others in the administration need to stop saying that China is contemplating this. They either need to explain to the American public why all of these reports are wrong, or they need to actually come to grips with reality in that China is actually helping the Russians with lethal assistance at this moment.
Gordon, that's a great point. I have to say, something I find extremely frustrating is that when it comes to Ukraine's security and safety, the U.S. is willing to speak about China and to China in this extremely aggressive, hawkish way and say, don't you dare, everybody has decided we're all going to help Ukraine and nobody's allowed to help Russia, right? But when it comes to our national security, when it comes to balloons flying over U.S. airspace, when it comes to China undercutting the U.S. market, they have nothing to say. It's all appeasement 100% of the time. Am I right to notice this discrepancy?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to notice that discrepancy. The Biden administration has a China policy, I assume, but what we are seeing are really very disconnected pieces of it. And clearly, I think the Biden team has not come to grips with reality about what is actually occurring. They are not moving fast enough. Because one thing, China is preparing to go to war, and it's showing utter disrespect for the United States. And we can see this with that balloon flight. Why did they think that they could get away with it? We see it, for instance, with their establishment of permanent police stations in the U.S. Fortunately, the one in New York is now closed. But the fact is, they felt that they could get away with opening it. And we see all sorts of other signs that China believes that the United States is in terminal decline, and they no longer have to deal with the Biden administration. I'm not saying that their assessment is correct. I'm just saying that's the way they think, and we can see it in their actions.
Mm-hmm. Well, last Thursday, China released a 12-point plan aimed at brokering a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine in which it called for a ceasefire.
Asked about what he thought of China's proposed plan, President Biden told ABC News it was not, quote, rational, and that it would only benefit Russia. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do not agree with that assessment. China's plan is rational if you have no respect for the United States. Now, Biden was saying it wasn't rational because it only benefited Russia. Well, yeah, that's true. And it certainly was, I think, misguided and certainly not helpful. But the point is that China thought that it could issue such a plan because it did not have to take into account the views of other countries. So once again, it shows China's mentality. And Biden has not yet come to terms with the fact that China doesn't think that he's a factor. Now, I believe China's wrong in that. But the point is, it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what China thinks, because that's going to guide it to do things which are extraordinarily dangerous. And Biden needs to start to understand that.
You know, Gordon, a few years ago, not too distant in the past, in a debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, when asked what the biggest threat to the United States was, Mitt Romney said Russia, and President Obama at the time, candidate Obama, he laughed at him. That was considered a ridiculous point of view. Fast forward to today, and that is the view that the Democrats seem to have assumed. Walk us through how that reversal happened.
I think that the invasion of Ukraine certainly had a lot to do with that. And clearly, I disagree with Romney, because I thought China was the biggest threat to the United States. Russia can pose a threat to the U.S. only because China has backing it. But the point is, we have seen things occur over the last couple of years which were once inconceivable. And that shows us that the international order is breaking down, that deterrence is no longer viable, because we are seeing that the Russians and the Chinese, in fact, are not deterred by us. So Biden has to reestablish deterrence. Reestablishing deterrence is one of the most dangerous things. Clearly, Biden is not up to it at this moment, because he doesn't even perceive the problems.
Well, now what would you make of the argument, though, that China might maybe think twice about, for instance, grabbing Taiwan if it's looking clearly at how Europe and the U.S. has responded to Russia invading Ukraine? They've responded with an open-ended, perhaps permanent commitment to supply as many weapons and as much money to the Ukrainian defense as necessary. If a Putin-type person thought this was going to be easy and there were going to be no consequences, it was certainly wrong in that respect. Is China contemplating a similar thing?
I think China is contemplating an invasion of Taiwan, because we know that they are, in fact, preparing to go to war. It's not only the military buildup, Robbie, but it's also Xi Jinping trying to sanction-proof his regime and the mobilization of civilians for war. Now, I don't know how the Chinese, in fact, view Ukraine. But, the argument you gave me is plausible. But I think a better argument is that China is not deterred, because the United States, the European Union, and Great Britain were not able, in fact, to prevent Russia from invading, even though the EU, U.S., Britain had an economy 25.1 times larger than Russia's in 2021. And we still couldn't stop him from invading in February of last year. Also, the sanctions have not been applied to stop Russia. They've caused pain to Russia, but they have not had the effect that we wanted them to. And so I think the Chinese see that as well. And I believe that the Chinese, and this is a guess, but I believe the Chinese are less deterred over Ukraine than they were before with regard to Taiwan.
And what about the Chinese economy? I mean, we're hearing, reports that there's trouble brewing there. There's a housing crisis. How does that impact China's decision about mobilizing for war?
Yeah, China's economy in last year did not grow 3.0%, as the Beijing reports. It probably fell about 3% because, among other things, they were fooling around with their inflation deflators. But, right now, this year, China's economy is still stumbling. It might grow this year because last year was so bad. But as you point out, the property prices are still falling. That's a major issue, and a political issue in China, because 70% of the wealth of the middle class is tied up in apartment units. I think that this is a factor that pushes Xi Jinping to go to war, because he wants to distract the Chinese people from his domestic policy mistakes, for which he has no answers, by the way. So a war would actually solve a lot of his issues. And we've got to remember, this guy can take us by surprise. He's extremely willful, and we have a White House and a Pentagon that has no sense of urgency over what's going on in Asia.
Gordon Chang, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Batya and Robbie.
We'll have more Rising right after this.